By 1864, the main focus of the American Civil War had become the continuing face-off between the Federal Army of the Potomac under General Grant and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia under General Lee. The two were locked in a complex series of battles and manoeuvres around Richmond and Petersburg. Grant's intention was to gradually tighten a grip around the Confederate capital. He was slowly succeeding because of the superior resources of the Union. Lee foresaw the plan with perfect clarity. If the Confederates were completely forced into a static defence of the capital, they would be denied the manoeuvring that was their best chance to counter superior Union numbers. It would become a siege, and that could only end in one way. In previous years, the Confederates had used the Shenandoah Valley as a route to launch counterattacks to disrupt this kind of Union manoeuvre. The Federal High Command decided to forestall such an attempt to disturb their main offensive by mounting a major secondary attack into the valley to clear the area of rebels. This would also have the additional benefit of denying the rich agricultural resources of the valley to the Confederacy. Accordingly, a large strike force under the command of General Franz Sigel was assembled in Maryland. Sigel was the epitome of the political officer. A graduate of the Karlsruhe Military Academy in Germany, he was one of the few insurrectionists in 1848 who had actual military training. With the failure of the revolutions, Sigel had fled to England and from there to the USA, where he became a US citizen. Sigel had a huge influence with German immigrants and was instrumental in recruiting large numbers of them into the Union armies. Politically he was very useful, however his actual military performance was patchy. The Union plan was to sweep down the Shenandoah Valley and meet up with another federal force under General George Crook at the important railway junction of Staunton. With Staunton occupied, supplies from the Shenandoah, the breadbasket of the Confederacy, were being able to reach Lee and Richmond. Various diversionary raids were made from West Virginia to try and confuse the defenders as to the exact axis of the Union advance. General Sigel's army was officially part of the Department of West Virginia. The components available at Newmarket consisted of one infantry division under General Sullivan and one cavalry division under General Starhill. Sullivan's division was made up of two brigades: Moore's brigade, mostly made up of Ohio troops, and Thorburn's brigade, made up of West Virginians, Pennsylvanians, and a Massachusetts regiment. Each brigade was about 2,500 strong. The troops were well trained and equipped, but not very experienced. Stahl's cavalry division also consisted of two brigades. Tibbetts' brigade was the larger, about 1,100 strong. Wickoop's brigade was only about half that size. The troops were from New York and Pennsylvania. As with the infantry, they were reasonably well trained and very well equipped with breech-loading carbines, but if anything they had even less experience. Sigel's army was well supported with artillery, some 5 batteries totalling 30 cannon in all, most of them rifled. Following the failure of the Gettysburg campaign, the steadily increasing size of the Union armies had forced the Confederates to strip secondary theatres in order to provide enough troops to hold the Richmond defences. The only rebel unit left in the valley was a small but experienced cavalry brigade under General John Imboden. This modest force had no hope of being able to check the Union advance, but aggressive skirmishing inflicted heavy casualties on the Union flanking units. More importantly, Imboden's veteran cavalrymen easily picked up the line of the main Federal advance, giving the rebels plenty of warning. The Confederate district commander was General John C. Breckinridge, a former Vice President of the United States who had distinguished himself in reorganizing the defences of the area. By a combination of diplomacy and clever administration, he had restored flagging morale and effectively doubled his available troop numbers. Armed with Imboden's detailed intelligence reports, he was able to quickly move all his available forces to a blocking position at the small town of Newmarket. Unfortunately, his total force didn't amount to very much. The leading element of Breckinridge's command was the aforementioned cavalry brigade under John Imboden. The centrepiece of this was the 18th Virginia Cavalry, some 450 veteran horsemen. Imboden also had 3 small bodies of Maryland partisans, maybe 250 in total, and a crack 8-gun horse artillery battery under McClanahan. Without access to the modern breech-loading carbines of their Union counterparts, many of the rebel cavalrymen had taken to using rifled muskets, even though they were cumbersome to operate on horseback, to at least give them some chance of matching the firepower of their opponents. Breckinridge had 2 small infantry brigades, all Virginians. Echol's brigade was about 1,400 strong, while Wharton's brigade was somewhat larger, about 1,800. Each infantry brigade was supported by a 4-gun artillery battery. As with all the more technical aspects of military operations in the Civil War, the Confederate guns were outclassed by their Union rivals, being only smoothbores or old howitzers. This total force was clearly insufficient, so Breckinridge called out the reserves, the local militia, and the cadet force from the Virginia Military Institute. Under the overall command of General Harmon, the Augusta County and Rockingham County militia consisted of boys not yet 18 years of age and men of over 45. They totalled about 900 or so, were poorly trained and disciplined, and only armed with shotguns and hunting rifles. It's perhaps for the best that they arrived too late for the battle. The most celebrated elements of the Confederate force at Newmarket were the cadets of the Virginia Military Institute. So many cadets had volunteered for service in the Confederate Army that the VMI had only been able to remain open by lowering the age of admission. Nonetheless, and in spite of all the talk of brave boys, most of the cadets who fought at Newmarket seem to have been between 16 and 18 years old. The oldest was 27. They also added a small 2-gun section of artillery to the Confederate force. In total there were about 250 of them. Even with scraping together all these forces, Breckinridge was still outnumbered and outgunned, but Sigel's erratic orders had allowed his force to become badly strung out, and he was to spend most of the morning of May 15th trying to get them into some kind of battle formation. This disorder gave Breckinridge his chance. If he attacked now, he would be fighting only part of the Union Army, and with luck could defeat them in detail. The town of Newmarket lay in the middle of the valley, with reasonable-sized hills to the south-southeast and north-northwest. To the east was the meandering Shenandoah River, and beyond that the high and impassable Blue Ridge Mountains. The Union advance was a curious combination of excessive caution, followed soon after by a frantic, hurried deployment far too far forward. The initial cautious advance meant that Imberden's cavalry had little difficulty holding the ground south of the town long enough for Breckinridge to form up his Confederate army behind the crest of the southern hills. Sigel seems to have been unaware of, or discounted reports of, hefty Confederate forces to his front. As a result, he allowed his army to become well strung out, and it was only when it was clear that a battle was imminent that he had to rush to concentrate them. The consequence of this was that not all of the Union army was present, and many of them had become exhausted by a forced march to get into a battle position. The Confederates massed their guns on the top of the southernmost heights and commenced a furious artillery exchange with the 2 Union batteries that had managed to set up. Breckinridge knew that time was not on his side. Delaying would only increase the chances of more Union troops arriving, so he ordered his infantry line to advance over the crest of the hill and move across the valley floor. Meanwhile, Imberden's cavalry swept wide on the right and completely surprised their Federal opposite numbers. Imberden ordered his artillery to fire, and the effect of McClellan's veteran battery was, as Imberden put it, magical. Shocked by the unexpected flurry of shot and their horses' spooked, the Union cavalry withdrew rapidly, exposing Sigel's flank. Meanwhile, the Confederate infantry advance was coming under heavy fire, and although they were giving as good as they got, a hole began to open up in their centre. Breckinridge was forced to commit the VMI cadets to plug the gap. The cadets made a spirited advance, and together with the 62nd Virginia, stormed a battery at some cost. Now under pressure from front and side, the local Union commanders pulled back half a mile to a new position. The rebels kept up their advance. Sigel strove to prevent a rout. He organised a Federal cavalry counterattack to try and forestall the rebel advance, but this was easily beaten off, and it was night that eventually saved him. By that time the Union army had been pushed back another 3 miles. The Battle of Newmarket has been called the most important secondary battle of the war. The Confederate victory completely unhinged the entire Federal offensive and secured the rich resources of the Shenandoah for most of the rest of the year. It took nearly 6 months for the Union armies to redeploy and sweep the valley in such overwhelming numbers that no amount of strategy or clever manoeuvring could hold them. Of course, Lee was forced to abandon Richmond anyway eventually, but the Battle of Newmarket certainly extended the war by many months. Newmarket was not a big battle, there being barely 10,000 participants, and it wasn't a particularly long one either, so casualties were not high, but they were significant considering the number of troops involved. Both sides suffered a loss of about 500, including an unusually high proportion of wounded. The Confederates also captured 5 cannon and took over 300 prisoners. John C. Breckinridge was primarily a politician, but he also turned out to be an effective military commander. He served well throughout the Civil War, although the Battle of Newmarket was his most significant victory. He continued to operate in the Shenandoah Valley for the rest of the year, until he was appointed Confederate Secretary of War by Jefferson Davis. With the collapse of the Confederacy, he fled abroad for 3 years, but returned to his native state of Kentucky after the issuing of general amnesty for ex-Confederates. He refused to re-enter politics, and worn out by injuries and stress, died in 1875. In contrast, Franz Sigel was a generally ineffective commander, especially so at Newmarket, although allegations that he was drunk during the battle are probably untrue. In view of his poor performance, Sigel was replaced by Major General David Hunter, but his high standing with the German immigrant community prevented any formal disciplinary action. 2 months later, he attempted to hold Harper's Ferry against a Confederate raid, but was replaced soon after by Brigadier General Albion Howe, another very controversial officer. This was Sigel's last operational command. He resigned from the army in 1865 and had a desultory political career post-bellum. He died in 1902. The efforts of the cadets of the Virginia Military Institute have been dramatised twice. The first, a very loose adaptation, was in the John Wayne film The Horse Soldiers. The action is moved westwards to the Mississippi region and takes place at least 12 months before the real event. The VMI is not mentioned by name, and the participation of the cadets is played for comic effect. A more serious effort was in the 2014 film Field of Lost Shoes. The title refers to the large numbers of soldiers' boots that were sucked off their feet by the muddy conditions. The film accurately details the battle and also that 10 VMI cadets were killed during the course of it. The role of the cadets at Newmarket is still commemorated at the Virginia Military Institute with a formal ceremony held during the finals week.